Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second webinar of Global Education Perspective Series. Today, we are privileged to have Dr. Barker from Oman giving us a presentation on how the pandemic kickstarted technology adoption in schools. The webinar is being recorded and will be shared publicly in YouTube, social media, and our GEP website. We will have 40 to 45 minutes of presentation, followed by 15 to 20 minutes of question and answers. You will remain muted during the webinar, but you can post your question on the chat box and Dr. Barker will respond to them later. A recorded version of this webinar will be available on the GEP YouTube channel later. Please see the chat box if you don't have them yet. Please note that for the people who are attending in our webinar looking to receive a certificate of participation, you must register in our website and provide us with the information that help us to send you the certificate of participation for our GEP webinars. We are very happy that we will host about 4 to 6 webinars per academic year. Our next webinar would be on November the 6th at 10 to 11 by Dr. Jayakodi from Sri Lanka. Dr. Jayakodi is with us today as well. Thank you for joining us. So I'm asking our co-host, Dr. Rodney, to introduce Dr. Barker with more detail. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. It is indeed an honor to introduce our guest speaker today, Miguel Barker. Dr. Barker is a Jamaican native. He comes to us with over 25 years of experience in education. He served as a mathematics teacher, a school administrator, a conference presenter, an educational consultant, an ASCD ambassador, an adjunct professor. Dr. Barker is currently the MYP coordinator and middle school assistant principal in Muscat, Oman. Without further ado, I'd like to ask Dr. Barker to begin with his presentation on how this pandemic has affected all of us. Dr. Barker, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for such a fantastic introduction. It's the kind of introduction that my mother, if she was alive, should have loved to hear. And I think up to now, my father still doesn't believe this, that I'm like this. So I'm really, really thankful that you, this opportunity, because it's really not only an opportunity to share with like-minded academics, but also to shape my own thinking on this. So what I'm sharing with you is not only a presentation, but also a process of my thought. So you're able to share in this, and perhaps in our question and answer session, this thought process can be tightened. So I welcome your participation as well as your just listening to what I'm saying. So I'm just going to put my presentation on screen so that I can get going. So, and again, thank you for listening. So here's the thing. The title of my presentation is a very bold one. The idea is that I said, ain't no stopping us now. And it harks back to a very popular song that used to be, if you're doing disco music, you'd know this song, and quite a number of people might remember this song. It's very, very upbeat, and the idea is that ain't no stopping us now. And the idea is that this pandemic, with all of the tragedies that come with it, I believe has kickstarted technology adoption in school. And for me, there's a paradox in that. You know, for me, it's really one of the interesting things that has gone in my mind, the idea that somehow, paradoxically, the pandemic has propelled pedagogy in some ways. And for me, that is really an interesting thing to come out of this. So in one sense, I'm trying to find a positive in a really, really tragic situation. And that is something that I believe that as educators, as people involved in student and learning, I think it's important that we can see what's happening here. So one of the things I always do at my presentations is say to people, if you want to interact, if you're in Zoom, you can do a thumbs up if the point makes sense to you, because I don't have the luxury of seeing your smiles and your faces and your nods to keep me going. So it's important that as I do this presentation, if you feel that something I say resonates with you, it's important that I know that it is resonating. And so if you want, you can use the clap function in Zoom. Chat window is there to put your questions or ask anything or say anything. And certainly if you can tweet at Mathda. Cherie alluded to my math background, and that's me, the Mathda. And certainly you can email me as well. So
I'm sorry, Dr. Barker, I need to interrupt you. Because of the security reasons, emotions are disabled on this.
No problem, no problem. So we'll make it work, don't worry, we'll make it work. So I have a picture here of the current state of the pandemic, and I want to use that as the basis to begin this conversation, because we are really in a very tragic time, a really serious time, a time where everyone begins to wonder about when will this end. At the moment, we have over 10 million people dying from this pandemic. So this presentation in no way is intended to look at this as something as a positive, but the situation is what it is. And so what I'm trying to look at is some of the outcomes that I see emerging from this pandemic in the last 6 to 7 months, and look at perhaps some of the promises, some of the possibilities that can come out of such a tragic circumstance. And so my talk is really one of positivity, but at all the time, I'd like you to bear in mind that I do understand that there's serious loss and there's a lot of suffering that is connected to this. But as educators, we are in a situation where the world is continuing and the majority of schools are going. We need to open, we need to start school. And so I just want you to understand that I empathize across the world with what's happening. So it's a tragic time. As I said, over 10 million people have passed away just from one disease. So one of the things that happened when we had the pandemic, for some reason, sorry, I just need to get this. So one of the things that happened is that once schools were closed in March, my example, I'm in Oman, and as someone mentioned, as Cherie mentioned, I am an assistant principal, and we went home on the Thursday, which is our weekend. And we were told on the Saturday evening that there will be no school on Sunday. And since then, we have not had students returning to the school. But we did open school on the Sunday, except that it was online. The biggest challenge there was that our teachers were not necessarily prepared to go to an online format. So there was a teething process, but eventually we had everyone delivering learning online. Now, there are many costs to this, and I've just listed here some of the costs that teachers will list across the world that came with not having students in school despite an attempt to have school. So the social interactions were lost right away. All the social interactions were lost. The daily buzz of school, that wasn't there anymore. People were trying to recreate that on Zooms, on Google Meets, on Microsoft Teams, and all the other softwares that were happening across the world. The practical lessons suffered. Science, design, physical education, they suffered. Teachers were trying to figure out, how can I recreate this? I need to be able to teach my science class, do my laboratory experiments, and so on. There was no face-to-face interactions, as I mentioned at the start of even this presentation. Assessment had to be changed. The natural flow, everything that we were planning to do in school, all of that changed. Physical exercise, there was no walking around. People lost even that ability to do physical exercise just by the day-to-day functioning of school. And certainly the kind of personalization that would happen for your classroom space and the kind of relationships that would be created, all of these were lost. So I could go on and on. There are so many things that were lost. And if we dwell on that, then we maybe would have said, it's not possible. But what happened is that we moved on. Now, prior to COVID-19, one of the biggest topics that was circulating in education and in academia was the idea of the VUCA world. And the context of it was certainly not one that was anticipating a global pandemic. It was more to do with the fact that there was a lot of technology constantly emerging, And the world that our students that were going to inherit needed education to take an about face and begin to prepare students for this new world. And so the context was more about trying to enthuse educators, motivate educators, inspire educators to take on the technology and begin to bring this into their practice, infuse it into their practice, so that our students would be able to face this volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world. So prior to COVID-19, the context was just about trying to move teachers from sticking to the dogmatic, the traditional approach, and to try and open their mind to say, can you change practice, look at different ways of approaching things so that our students would be better prepared for this world. And so the context of it was that the world was volatile, and this was about technology and all that. Environment was changing, and it was changing quickly. It was unpredictable. So the new apps coming out, the demands of learning and the new technology that was coming out, we needed to be ready for that. Our students needed to be ready for that. It was uncertain. Environment requires you to take action, but we were uncertain about what we needed to do with that. It was complex because it was constantly changing. What's coming next? What's the next thing? Holograph? Was it going to be augmented reality? Was it virtual reality? It was all these things that was happening. And certainly it was ambiguous because one of the things was that many teachers were still not ready for this. And so the VUCA world was the biggest one. If you go to any conference, quite likely there'll be 2 or 3 conversations around the idea of VUCA. And this was like a buzzword that was used to describe the change that as educators needed to do to inform their pedagogy so that there was, greater, greater authenticity to what they were doing and to ensure that students would feel as if the school was responding to their needs. But then within school, there was the issue of technology integration. So there was one battle out there, the inspirational idea that we all need to be ready for the world. And then in school, we had the challenge of trying to integrate technology to overcome, the intransigence that exists in school in terms of making these changes. So there would be the thing they call about the SAM-R model for technology integration, where, tech would, most times you'd find, this was like a staged, a ladder of integration. And so you find, for example, that technology for the most part was used as a substitution. It was just substituting for something that schools were doing. For example, I remember listening to a conversation with Alan November, and he described our laptops as a $1,000 pencil, because many teachers were just using it to type stuff that students would write in book. They weren't really optimizing the advantages of having these tools in the classroom. And the funny thing is, I saw a picture yesterday, kind of like a meme, and it was saying that prior to COVID, mobile phones, students were allowed in school, but not with their mobile phones. And now we're in a situation where students can't go to school, but mobile phones is the way that they might be accessing school. So it's kind of like a nice switch on that. But the point here is that substitution was the main way in which technology was being used in school, just to substitute for something, but teachers weren't changing practice. They weren't doing anything different. And augmentation was slowly coming in. But really the debate was whether this was happening anywhere. Redefinition of practice due to the fact that technology was now so infused in practice that it was not discernible what was the change was now based around the technology, like an integration of both traditional practices or teacher functioning and technology supporting that. So that redefinition was still not there. So the context in education was about, can we move teachers in this space? So what we had, another thing that was affecting technology was the idea of a digital divide, meaning there were some people who had access to technology and some people didn't have the access but not only the access to the technology, but also inadequate internet access. A lot of people some had dial-up type technology and some just did not have the right kind of technology to access that, and they didn't have the right kind of internet access as well. And even some cases, people have devices, but they were inadequate devices. So there was this digital divide that existed. And it's not only in the rich countries. This digital divide existed across the world, but it was more pronounced in countries that did not have the resources to support the kind of investment to support learning within schools. And so I'm trying to set the stage to show you how the pandemic this was the state of play, and then how the pandemic has slowly moved this conversation away from, are we going to get teachers to start using technology more? Are we going to get teachers to start thinking about the future and think about modifying their practice to prepare their students for the future by using the kind of technology that would ensure that they would be ready to face the future? And would governments begin to make the investments to close that digital divide across the different countries in the world? So this was the stage prior to the pandemic. And then we had the pandemic. So we had the pandemic and all of that tried to change. Now, to kind of show you a little bit about the digital divide, I want to talk a little bit about a very, very, I'd say a wealthy country, the US, a country that has the resources. And this is a report that came out this year from Common Sense Media. They do a report, it was a well-researched report. You would see the data on this, and the citation for it is here. So you can actually look at this if you find this interesting. It was conducted by Common Sense through the Boston Consulting Group. And what they found, well, there are 50 million students, roughly, students learning from home now in the US because of the pandemic. But what they found in this report was startling, really, really interesting about the digital divide that existed in a country that perhaps would have the resources. By all accounts, the richest country and the largest economy that exists in the world. But 400,000 teachers lack adequate internet connectivity. Approximately 8% of teachers in the US is considered to not having adequate internet connectivity. About 100,000, this is coming straight from the report, lack an adequate device for teaching. 1 in 4 students, a quarter of the students lack adequate internet. The kind of internet that would be able to handle even a conversation like this, where Zoom, they can watch an entire day of learning. They did not have that. 15 to 16 million live in households without adequate internet or adequate device. Now, in this report as well, they frame a mobile phone as an inadequate device to actually receive online education, distance learning. So that's including that, but that's about 30% of the students, children going to school in the US. Learning loss was certainly going to be a factor. And they noticed as well that this was more so pronounced in the rural and minority communities most affected by what they call the homework gap. But the point I'm trying to point out here is that this existed prior to COVID. COVID didn't cause this. What we found when COVID came up was that this information was not relevant enough to be discussed and raised as a policy issue. In the past, this was something that could be pushed across and said, we're doing the best we can. Now COVID, because 50 million students were now learning from home, this conversation moved to the top of the table as to how can we address this. Sorry, let me just close this, sorry. So, just some data from this. There are some, it was interesting reading, and I just wanted to share just the nature, just to understand what was happening for the digital divide. So I mentioned this data already. They use certain terminology, fully disconnected, 9 million students in the US, fully disconnected. 5 to 6 million were what they call internet insufficient, meaning their internet was just not good enough to connect to the internet. But they did have a device that could work, but just was not good enough to receive distance learning in a way that would be seen as adequate. And some were what they call device deficient, but they were device deficient. So they had a device that they would not work, but they had perhaps connection to good internet services. So in that sense, there's a kind of language that's coming out: fully disconnected, internet insufficient, device deficient. And it provides a kind of angle for research to see how, how things are changing with this, or might have changed since this report was done. This was done quite early in COVID. Just another few graphs that I grabbed from this to see which states. And you can see that as you move maybe towards, maybe in the Midwest, you'll see more of this scenario where without, for example, Mississippi, 50% without adequate internet connection, 36% without adequate device. This is just the data. I'm not in any way just showing you what's happening. And likewise, states, more information from different type of states and the kind of information that we were picking up here. But this is recently concluded. This is data that was there prior to COVID. It's a quote that I found interesting because I want to allude to, if I remove this part, Jessica, elementary school teacher, Oakland in California, many people would think this is coming from a country like even my home country. But this is actually in the US of A. 30% of our families currently do not have internet at home. You know, and then they speak about the challenges. Parents needing the phone for their own communication needs. Parents being at work, students unable to access online work, so on. This is the state of play. Now, what has happened? Because COVID has come onto the scene, governments are now having to make different kind of decisions. The priority has shifted. And it is rather paradoxical that it needed a pandemic for people to start saying, perhaps there was a digital divide that needed to be closed, and we needed to be invested more into closing this gap. So what we are seeing is a conversation around the idea of whether teachers needed to be made ready. There was no focus on what kind of training would we provide for teachers in order for them to be ready to deliver learning in an online platform. Now, before, it was seen as if that was something that schools would do over time, or you could pick up your own professional development. That responsibility started to shift back to saying, we need to ensure that teachers are ready, and we need to make decisions that ensure that everyone. So for example, I cited the US as an example, but Oman, where I am in, Oman delayed the start of school in order to put forward a training program for their staff where everyone is trained to use one platform in order to deliver learning online. Now, imagine that from March to now. If it wasn't for pandemic, this would not even have been a thing that a government would consider doing, to stop school and train everyone to use a particular platform and teach them how to use particular resources. So teacher readiness was moved to the front of the queue in order to get this technology rollout that schools have been speaking about and governments have been speaking about for years, but they never did and made the steps that were necessary. Whatever was needed, it was not done at the time. I mean, I look at Jamaica, for example, another example, when I talk about teacher readiness. Every teacher in Jamaica has been put, there's another extreme when we talk about the US. Every teacher has been put on a training program to learn how to use Google Classroom, because the government has made a decision that they all will have to learn to use Google Classroom to deliver learning. Now imagine March of this year, and by November of this year, every teacher, if we took the pandemic, if you fell asleep in March and you didn't know there was a pandemic, and you woke up in December as a teacher and you walk into school and everyone has been trained to use a particular platform, you'd be like, what happened? Have I woken up in a twilight zone? Because that's not the nature of how change from a policy level tends to happen. The rapidity of this change is absolutely phenomenal. And then we talk about, so, and the UK is doing the same. I mean, I was on the UK website, they sent something out to say, any student who does not have the device that they can use to access learning, the school can make a bid for it, and the government is willing to provide a tablet or a laptop. Even in Jamaica today, I saw something in the news to say the government has pledged that they are going to provide a laptop or a tablet to all students. And they have also provided a tablet to all teachers. Point I'm making is just that if you fell asleep in March, and I'll say this again, and you woke up now, you'd be like, what happened? How is it that technology has just moved to, how technology absorption has just swiftly been now accepted as a must do? And that's my point. With 10 million deaths, out of that 10 million deaths, somehow something has shifted in education. And so I just want to keep that motive as I walk through this presentation. Instructional content, people are now looking at how to design learning a lot more than before, because a lot of, as I mentioned, the $1,000 pencil, as Alan November mentioned, it is important that we understand that for many people, they deliver learning in the way that they're comfortable. But online, it's a whole different experience for the person delivering the learning and this person receiving the learning. And a lot of teachers are remarked about how difficult it is for them to know whether students are making progress. But that is always a question that educators should always That was a question that educators should always have been having. But a lot of teachers felt that by their presence in the classroom and by them speaking about it, that was enough. Now they have to think deeply about, when I say this, what do I want students to do with this? When I use this resource, what exactly am I trying to achieve in the learning process? And so the instructional content and structure is now given a re-examination by all, because now that has to be looked at. Now, digital literacy training, mentioned just even learning how to use the digital resources out there and understanding even more about even data, sharing of data and all this. This is coming to the forefront. Technical support to the forefront as well. Teachers know, schools are now thinking, if everyone has a laptop, if all the kids, we're gonna have to look at how do we support these people. And certain, as I mentioned, technology supply is going to be increased. Certain that the US will start looking at what can we do to close this divide. This digital divide will be closed. It will be a much closer, a much smaller divide than it was prior to March in the pandemic, because there will be efforts now at making those, closing those gaps. So what we will see emerging, and this is me thinking ahead, and some of these are coming from there's a suggestions, the recommendations within the report that I spoke about. The policymakers will now start to look at what do they need to do in the short term for technology, but certainly they'll be looking at a long-term end goal. And certainly that would maybe be looking at, can we ensure that every child, every teacher has the kind of connectivity that they need and the kind of device that they need in order to be able to access learning online. School districts will start to look at how they can improve this digital education, making it clearer what do we mean by this. And they certainly will be looking at how to improve capabilities and the type of technology that will be out there. Just look at that from March to now. That would have been something that it's a goal, but now this is a now issue. It has moved this to the front in every level. Private sector have been asked to contribute now, because in the past, the private sector could contribute if they see a quid pro quo kind of setup. Now, private sector is being asked, do you really have to charge this price for internet and for schools? And can you do it for free? Can you provide resources much cheaper than you used to do this? Education, organization, and charities, everyone's looking at what can they do to close the gap. This is now bringing technology to the front of the queue. Equity lens is now enabled. Before it was maybe about we do what we can, equality. Now people are looking and saying, what can we do to give the different groups what they need in order to be successful? And so that device deficient child will now be getting what they need, compared to saying, we gave this to the district and they now need to, all districts get the same amount of money, that kind of thing. So it is important that the changes are going to be far reaching and not just to address a pandemic. One of the things that I without doubt feel it in my core, that after the pandemic, many of the practices that we see that have been put in place will have a massive impact on what teachers do for pedagogy. Because one of the things that we see that will emerge is that our students have no choice but to develop behaviors of develop self-managed learning practices. They'll move away from teachers will have to move away from a pedagogic focused practice to more like a utagogic kind of practice in order to get students to become self-managed learners, because they're left with instructions and they now need to manage themselves. Now they have to learn certain skills in order to do that. Those skills are not going to be gone. Those skills are going to be continually used in order to move forward and accelerate learning in that sense. Teachers would now become more aware and mindful of the kind of practices that they're using in the classroom. So in coming towards the end of my presentation, one of the things that I started to do was think about what are some of the promises and some of the possibilities that possibilities that will come based on the context that I've outlined. The context of March to now, the twilight zone, you wake up, and then now we have all these things due to a really tragic plague that has hit the earth. So some of the things that I see that will happen is that students will become really familiar with the concept of online learning. Students are across the world, and this is where this is even more phenomenal. This is not just some countries. every country is now looking at what can we do to get our students to be able to function online. In a sense, it's like this is going to be what they call the new normal. Can we have a scenario where, and the ramifications for this is immense, because certain places in the world may never have considered this, but now students across the world are looking at this. Certainly, I can use my example, Jamaica, where I am familiar with. The idea that the majority of students in Jamaica will have been logging on online this week to engage in learning, and teachers logging on to do this, is Twilight Zone. You know, it is Twilight Zone. And that's not going to be something that can be erased. It's going to be something that can only be built on. You know, when we talk about shortage of quality of teachers, can teachers now teach larger groups, but through online learning with people in specific schools providing support? So that's one of the possibilities that will emerge from this. But because we have already crossed the line of saying, can we do this? Now people will look at what can we do with it. Teachers' engagement with online learning, online teaching resources is absolutely amazing how this, I mean, so many teachers would never have looked at these resources. They would not have been looking at Google Classroom. They'd not have been trying other resources that were free and available. But now teachers' engagement with these, not only from the perspective of a workshop, but actually using it in their day-to-day practice. When the pandemic is gone and people are back face-to-face, those practices will still be there. People will still have the experience of using it and see the value of now using these in the classroom. One of the things that, and I think I heard, I think Dr. Toot mentioned this, if I got his name correctly. The idea that now that we're in the pandemic, we are able to do things that we could have been doing a long time ago, but we just never did it. The idea that I can be even presenting on this with this university would have been maybe something that people didn't think was possible, yet this is maybe the most comfortable way to do this, the most cost-effective way to do this. I would maybe have to fly to the US, get into a conference room, book rooms, and all that to do the very same thing. Now we're looking, hey, we don't need to do this. We could get the most amazing speakers from around the world and bring them right into their living room. So, but even within teachers, the idea of collaborating becomes a lot easier now, because before people just never thought that they did not do this. Now it is becoming common practice to say 3 teachers in different schools could get on a Zoom call and plan something, organize something, and they don't have to see each other. Maybe they don't even know each other very well. So there will be increased collaborative practice, not only intra-school, but also inter-school, and also not only regionally or nationwide, but also internationally and globally. You can now easily build connections with people international without worrying about that geographical divide. Those technology existed long before COVID, but COVID has just pulled that together and said, what were you waiting on? Now people are doing this quite naturally. One of the things that came out of COVID, just the concept that websites can be what we call zero rated. Now, for many people, this is maybe news. I mean, I remember talking in about maybe 4 months ago about zero-rated websites. The idea that there are websites that there is no need for you to have a data package in order to access these websites. Now, why am I pointing out this? Now, we know that if you're stuck somewhere, you don't even need data to call 911 or any emergency number. That's built in. That was always a function that was controlled by the telecommunications providers, but they could charge for whatever they wanted to do. But with COVID, that was moved to the front of the queue, this idea that if everyone's gonna have to access it, couldn't these telecommunications companies just make these sites data free, zero rated? You just can access them once you're on a Wi-Fi, but there's no need for you to use data to access it, or you have any data connection. You just need to use it, but you don't need to be using a data package to use these sites. Now, for example, this is happening worldwide, and people are now using this to solve problems in rural areas that they could have done before, but just it wasn't a topic that people knew, it wasn't an idea that was there. I mean, in Jamaica now, the government released a list of about 50 websites that are zero rated. You know, many sites that you would use data to access, the government is saying we have reached an agreement that no one needs to use data to access this. Now, after COVID, it's very difficult to roll that back, to put that toothpaste back in the tube. So now it's going to be an agreement about which sites will be zero rated. But it's also open an avenue to have these conversations, which, private sector may never want to have had before. There's a multiplicity of platforms. Now the jargon is Google Classroom, Microsoft Teams. Which one are you using? These were all before Schoology, there's so many. Now people are talking in this language and are familiar. They can find the ones that they find more comfortable to use, or governments will make decisions. But the fact is, everyone's now more aware of these platforms. Certainly a deeper consideration of engagement in the learning process. Now, initially, I think a lot of teachers may not have thought deeply about this, but from my personal experience as an administrator, now when I talk with teachers about learning, I can see that thought process going. I am using this activity, and the learning expectation from this, what I expect students to learn from this, is this. Online, you have to think deeply about this. Now, I don't believe teachers will go back and just say, I'll forget this practice. Because now it's more considered, and so the activities that teachers use are going to be, it will take them into that space much faster. It has taken them into that space much faster than they may have gone in the past. Again, the twilight zone, you wake up and now people are talking about specifically what they want to achieve from this activity. When I have a discussion with my class, what is the purpose of it? Because having a discussion on Zoom for 1 hour has to have some form of momentum. So if you're on Zoom, you're gonna have to think deeply about the questions you're gonna ask to generate the kind of responses that will keep you going. I mean, last night I was on a Zoom with John Hattie for free, and he's talking about visible learning platform, and stuff. I'm on that, it's free. Now people are offering a lot of these free because they're realizing, and normally I'd have to fly to some country, spend 2 days and do this workshop and come back home. Now people are now going, I mean, Alfie Kahn was offering, Alfie Kahn is one of the greatest thinkers out there, and he's talking about, some of the things, his view on education, and he's offering a workshop for $75. Normally you'd be paying $300, $400, $500, $1,000 and flying somewhere to see these conferences. Now, professional development is more accessible, but also resources are more accessible. A lot of these are being offered for free of cost as well. It's more efficient use of time and resources. By school, meetings are shorter and more meaningful. I don't think people will go back to the long wasting time meetings. I firmly believe that I may, even after COVID, have meetings online. Just say log in from where you are and we'll have the meeting. I believe I'll still maintain that. 20 minutes and we get so much done when we'd spend an hour before, and as I said, resources are also well used. Blended learning is now a normal conversation. That was controversial at one point. Is it useful? Is it not? No, it's normal. It's now almost normal. And many schools, as they start to look at space and resources in terms of teaching resources, they might look at a blended learning format because now they've tested it, they've tasted it. They're like, maybe we could do this. Personalized learning is far more prevalent now. I can see even my own child, where teachers can set different tasks without having to manage a class while doing this. They can now do this in a more discrete format, discrete way, and support students as well more discreetly. Differentiation as well will come with resources. They're finding resources that allows differentiation to happen more frequently and more impactfully. Assessment resources, I mentioned, are varied. You can flip grid. You can get them to do a video now. Now, in the past, some teachers were trying this. No, teachers are like, if I can't see them, perhaps I can ask them to tell me the process that they use to solve this math. Because I don't know if maybe someone did it for them. But if I say, walk me through by using something like Flipgrid, and I'll listen to what you said, and then I'll provide feedback, but I'll speak my feedback. I don't have to write my feedback. Imagine that. Your teacher isn't present, but now you can listen to that feedback 5, 10 weeks later. Otherwise, you'd have to try and remember that conversation. But I can also listen to what my students were saying 5 weeks ago, and now I hear what they're saying. They can compare that. So there's a lot of things that's happening now that maybe would not have happened, but the technology was always there. That's my point. parental involvement is optimized. There was a time when parental involvement was for some kind of schools and some types of communities. Now, the biggest joke is we see circulating on the engagement that is asked of some parents and how they find that challenging. But that's going to be part of the teething process. Now, once we find ways, I mean, I was on a conversation recently and we're saying part of the conversation we're having with our management team is how do we educate the parents about what is expected in the distance learning process. And we have to think deeply about how we do this, because it doesn't work without getting that part of the triangle functioning. If that vertex is out, we don't have a triangle. And now schools are thinking deeply rather than saying we have a school that, you know, parents are involved or not. Now this is seen as a must. I don't think we'll go back to a point where that is left hanging. Video conferences, screen recording, you can now have some things. Many people would never have gone on a screen are now on a screen. Many people would have never done a screen recording are now recording themselves, because this is now the expectation. I could go on and on with so many possibilities and and provide a kind of optimism that has emerged from this, you know, this tragic circumstance. But as an educator, I look forward with great optimism about how the world, how a pandemic where we lost so many people, how this pandemic in such a short space of time has kickstarted the absorption of technology in schools. And I close with that thought because that's really where the thesis of my presentation, that something as tragic as a pandemic has managed to kickstart technology absorption across the world, not only in rich and powerful nations, but even countries that do not have the kind of resources they are looking at investing now and prioritizing in the development of teachers, students, and engaging parents in that process. So that's also one of the curves that needs to be flattened as well and is beginning to be flattened. So thank you for listening. I hope that my thought process is one that resonates with you, and I look forward to your questions. And over to you, Sherry.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barker, for such an enlightening and informative presentation. At this time, we're going to open up for question and answers, but I'm quite sure that we don't want it to be in that format of just questions and answers. We want to open it in such a way that we have a discussion, because there are so many information that you have just imparted on us, and there are so many things. I'm curious about a lot of things, and I'm quite sure that the other participants are as well. I'm going to start off this question, but I noticed that there is, Dr. Toot has also made a point in our chat about some of the things that are lost when we, of course, move on to virtual spaces for education, and what are we losing when we, miss out on the face-to-face. So we're going to take up on that, but I want to begin first, though, Dr. Barker, on one of the points that you made in your presentation on possibilities. And the first point was that students will become more familiar with online learning. So I'm in a situation where my colleagues and I have been talking a lot about Zoom, and as swiftly as we want COVID to be done, is the same type of feel many of us have in terms of Zoom. We want Zoom to be done as well, because there's a thing called Zoom fatigue. And I mean, there are times when from meeting to meeting and we're just tired. Yeah. Of course, if we are feeling that way as educators, how do our students feel at this time? Do you anticipate any form of tensions with students in regards to just being overwhelmed by using online platforms?
Yes. You use the term tension, and I intended to speak a little bit about the tensions in this presentation, but I refrained from doing it for want of having too many different explorations in the one presentation. But certainly there are a lot of tensions. One of them is synchronous, asynchronous, the roles of teachers, students, and in normal schools, perhaps parents as well. At higher education, it may be the role of teachers and students. And also, you mentioned Zoom fatigue, time, how long, these are tensions. How much is enough? You know, these are important points. My exploration in this is not so much to try and make so much as an excuse for what's happening, because what is happening is out of our control. You know, what is happening now is what we have to deal with. We can't, my exploration in this is not to say that Zoom is good or Zoom is bad, or whether more Zoom is better or less. My conversation is more around the fact that as an educator, if you look at March to now, how many hours have you spent on a video conferencing platform? That is like the kind of professional development that you'd never have had. I mean, you would now be an expert in Zoom. When this is finished, you will now be able to say, I think I'll do this one on Zoom, and I'll do this one face-to-face. But you would not go, am I able to do a Zoom session? Am I able to engage learners in a Zoom session? You'd be like, I can do both. That's another arsenal in my tool. Do I need to get all my students to come if I have a prep session, for example, to go through something? If 10 students said, you know, I had this session with you and I feel like I want you to go over this. You'd be like, let's get on a Zoom. You wouldn't have to teach your students how to get on a Zoom. You wouldn't have to tell them how to behave on a Zoom. You wouldn't have to tell them which device they need to get on a Zoom. You wouldn't have to tell them which part of their house they need to go and sit to go on a Zoom. Everyone is now comfortable in this. So I can't change the twilight zone. What I am looking at is how we will be changed by coming through that twilight zone, by the transformation in our practice and the tools that are now available to us due to the fact that we are in this twilight zone. But certainly there are practices as we continue in this twilight zone that different people, different schools have to start looking at. But my exploration in this is more to do with the idea of how we have been transformed as technology users in this space. So Zoom fatigue, yes, but on the plus side, we are experts on Zoom. On the plus side, we have Zoom in our arsenal now. On the plus side, our students are now efficient and effective Zoom users. On the plus side, we are now even better at using Zoom to impart learning than we were before. On the plus side, when time is an issue and space is an issue, we know that Zoom can save us. So that's really where my piece on that is.
Definitely. Thanks, Dr. Barker. Could you turn your attention a bit to Dr. Toot's ideas about what's missed in the face-to-face discussions? For a better view, Dr. Barker, in the chat, Dr. Toot has asked, is it something we can talk about? Developing the face-to-face accountability. Can you say something about that?
Developing that face-to-face. I'm trying to understand maybe Dr. Toot could.
I had a truck here that just left. It was making so much noise that I just wasn't even going to try to speak, but he just left. I guess, and I realize in some ways this is very much a first world view that, you know, we've been spoiled in having, you know, the teacher who is a good teacher, who is an educated teacher in the room, one-on-one interactions. The teacher holds the student accountable, the parents and the students hold the teacher accountable. And I'd be a little worried that the more detached the expert becomes, the less that interaction occurs. And then maybe even, this is really speculation from somebody living in white America, but I wonder to what extent does the development of local teachers actually also an important goal, that the local teacher becomes, you know, a new resource and a developing resource. And if we lean too much on the international expert, we lose that part of the process as well.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah. Now, I think that's a valid point. I think at all times we have to remember that most of this is forced upon us. You know, we are in these situations. So even the disconnect that's happening, there's very little that we can do to undo that without, you know, people back in school. But what we can learn in this, and again, I always will push it to what we can learn from this, is I think now teachers will have to think deeply about engagement. You know, in the past, there was a divide between quality learning and quality teaching. Many teachers maybe would say, I taught and used these resources, why aren't students learning? And the idea is that engagement was not part of that conversation. Well, what really can I do to engage learners? Because we're now not in the familiarity of a classroom setting where you can, use your presence as a way of saying that people are listening, they're quiet, they're listening. The idea of students are, they say that when the learning happens when the students are listening and the teacher is talking. So the students are listening and the teacher is talking, learning is happening. But, there's the other side of it is where perhaps they're learning when they're talking and I'm teaching when I'm listening. That's another perspective. I'm teaching when I'm listening and they're learning when they're talking. So it's about trying to figure out a way in which you can engage learners to share with you how they learn. And that's where the power of technology comes in, because if you can't see them in the classroom, to have that one-to-one and see their faces, you're gonna have to think deeply, what can I do to know that they are learning? I've just shared something. What can I do? Am I gonna ask them to take a picture of their work and send it to me? Is that enough? I don't think that's gonna be enough, because what if it's their brother or their sister or their mother or their father who's done it? To find another way exploratory practice and find ways to now really focus on learning. What happens is when we go back to the time when we're face to face, those practices are still going to be useful. I think teachers will start thinking, maybe when I see a child writing out the math in their book and give it to me and I go, yeah, they understood. Maybe that was not enough. Can I get them to talk about what they just did? And perhaps you see a different practice emerging. So I just feel that even the lack of the face-to-face, when we do have face-to-face, if the people who want to learn from this will learn from it. But even now, they'll now have to engage in a different practice. So certainly we can't, in my school, we're trying to find a way to get connections going, like pastorally. But even then, it's mechanical, it's still over a distance. So, but teachers are finding ways to connect in small groups because Zoom is allowing that, and so on. But my point is that we will learn a lot from this because we're doing stuff that we wouldn't have done between March and now.
Very nice. I would also like to thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I've learned a lot, and personally, I found it so much interesting. And I wanted also add to the point that you made, not only teachers had the kickstart to adopt using technology, but also students also had to learn and use the technology. It doesn't matter how old they are, if they are kindergarten students or...
Exactly.
They are really seeking every day to find a way.
I have I've got a question. If we have a minute, are we still? You think?
Yes, Tim.
No, I was thinking about. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Barclay. It's really, really interesting, Dr. Parker. I'm thinking about you're a principal. Isn't that correct at your school?
I'm an assistant principal.
I was wondering, as you think about the teachers that are being trained to come to your school now, what do you hope they're learning about while they're still in college to get ready for this new world of learning? Teacher educators.
Great question.
Wow. The sad part of it is that here's the sad part of it. If you're in teacher training now, you will miss out on all of this. And what you may find, here's a really interesting outcome that may come out of this, because normally the new teachers coming in are the ones who are the technology savvy ones. They're going to be the ones that will be coming in with all the ideas and trying to get the old fogies to. You may find that when they come into school, the old fogies are ahead of them. Because they have had 6 months of working online with kids and know what it's like to transform practice. So this is just a thought, perhaps because they would not have experienced technology from the perspective of a teacher. They would have experienced it from the perspective as a learner. So when they come to the classroom, weirdly enough, the old fogies might be a little bit further on the technology use and the skills and the practices than they are. And that is really a kind of turn up for the books, because I can tell you the majority of my staff, the conversations we're having now about technology, I could only have dreamt of it. It would only happen a few weeks, a few days after they went on a conference and came back and are excited about the conference. And then we'd go back to normal. Now we're like talking about, people are constantly emailing me and saying, hey, I just found this resource. And we're like, please don't give the kids any more things. Please just stick to 5 things. Let's not give any more things. But everyone's searching for stuff because they feel that they can enhance their practice by adding. So Tim, your question is one that is yet to be seen, but my perspective on is that those new teachers maybe will struggle when they come out, because they'll find that they are not the most advanced on technology use. Yeah.
I'm going to say one other thing too. We've had some interesting feedback from our students that are student teaching this semester about how like both the mentor teacher and the student teacher end up kind of doing collaborative learning together in terms of like figuring out how to do this. So like they each of them knows something that benefits the other. So there's been some nice synergy that way between our student teachers and their host teachers.
Exactly. Yeah. That's true. And now the conversation is an easier one to have.
Yeah.
Yeah. There's no generational divide now on technology. I think this has also closed that gap. Certainly it is a curve that's flattened a little bit. Yeah.
Great. Are there any other questions? Anybody else want to make a point? I think I'll go ahead with something that I noted. Miguel, I was a bit curious about this, your talk on support for educators, especially the aspect of instructional content. You did make mention that these things are readily available online. Content is there. We have no shortage of that. But one of my thinking about this, there are content there that I feel are problematic, could spread misinformation, if you ask me. What are some of your ideas or suggestions about how we go about identifying some of these as educators?
You know, as we are more using the internet more and are expecting our kids to be on the internet more than before, and more kids and more teachers are on the internet. I mentioned the point about digital literacy, you know, and that's gonna become part of more so now than before. It was always, but the need for it may not have been seen as so, you know, now the idea that it needed to be so urgent. The word I'm looking for is urgent.
Yeah.
People felt that at some point in time we may get to that. I think now, because we are now forced to be online, and as you mentioned the point about information being out there and students needing to be critical thinkers and better, more literate about media and information. I think as we send students online, we are going to have to change the way that we send them online. You know, what I see a lot of schools are doing is taking people off Google and putting them within spaces that schools have curated themselves. Mm-hmm. But that is a practice that now is even more important, that they do that. The other part of it in relation to, I think governments will spend more time now also training teachers and students in being more confident in this space and more secure in this space. But again, you know, as I said, this is what we are in. And it's maybe what we learn from this and how we take the possibilities from this that's going to determine how meaningful this session, this time was. So
yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Barker. Mina, I pass over to you.
Thank you, and I would pass over to Tim for.
So, yes, we're passing the mic around. We want to thank all of you so much for coming to and joining us today, and particularly a big thank you to Dr. Barker for his wonderful presentation, all these great ideas, and really stimulating content. I really enjoyed it. I appreciated your perspective on like the paradox of this time, that, you know, along with all the bad, there are so many good things that will come out of it as well. And I'll take away the notion too of thinking about like that this year of online learning being toothpaste that's not going back in the tube. That's a useful way of thinking about it. Like, where do we go from here? So I've enjoyed your presentation so much, as well as the questions. I want to thank everyone that helped to put this together, and thank you for coming. And in particular, I think we've all had a nice time together, so be sure and plan to come back when we do this again in November. Bring along a couple friends if you like. Again, just to Mina mentioned at the outset, but on November 6th at 10 a.m., we'll be hearing from Dr. Jaya Cody, who will be our next presenter, and we'll look forward to seeing you all again that day. And thank you so much for coming, and have a nice weekend.
Thank you. Thank you very much.